Ethan Crawford grabbed the divorce papers and hurled them across the conference table directly at his wife's face. The stack hit her chest and scattered across the floor. He didn't apologize. He stood over her, straightened his jacket, and said to the room, not to her, to the room, "Pick them up, sign them, and then get out of my building." 7 lawyers watched. 4 board members watched. Nobody moved to help her. His girlfriend stood in the doorway, smiling. Claire Crawford bent down, gathered every page from the floor with her bare hands, sat back down, and signed her name. She walked out carrying one small suitcase. Nobody in that room knew they had just handed a $38 billion woman $2 million and called it generous. Now, before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. The morning of the divorce. Claire Crawford woke up at 5:15 the same way she had woken up every morning for the past 10 years. Not because she had to. Not because someone was waiting for her. But because silence had become her most familiar companion, and in the early hours before the city woke up, she allowed herself the one luxury she never permitted in public, the luxury of feeling everything she spent the rest of the day pretending she didn't feel. She made coffee. She stood at the window of their penthouse on the 53rd floor. She looked out at Manhattan, still wrapped in its pre-dawn darkness, all those lit windows stacked against the black sky like 1,000 little lives being lived by people who had no idea her world was ending today. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't call her sister. She didn't pray, though she had done a great deal of that in the past 3 years, as the marriage had slowly, methodically collapsed from the inside out, like a building whose foundation had been quietly rotting for years. She just stood there and drank her coffee and watched the city breathe. And then she got dressed. She chose a simple navy blue dress. No jewelry except small pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. Low heels, her hair pulled back, no elaborate makeup. She looked as she had always looked, like a woman who was deliberately trying not to take up too much space in the world. That was the thing about Claire Crawford that most people misunderstood. They thought she dressed plainly because she didn't care about appearance. They thought she stayed quiet in rooms full of powerful people because she had nothing to say. They thought she deferred to Ethan at dinner parties and charity galas and corporate events because she was meek, passive, the classic trophy wife who had traded her ambitions for a wealthy husband and a beautiful apartment and a life made of elegant emptiness. They were wrong about all of it. But Claire had learned a very long time ago that the world's tendency to underestimate quiet women was not always a disadvantage. Sometimes it was armor. Sometimes it was a strategy. And for 10 years she had worn her invisibility like a second skin, even when it cost her more than she ever admitted to anyone. The car arrived at 7:30. The law offices of Brennan Holt and Associates occupied 3 full floors of a midtown skyscraper, and when Claire stepped off the elevator into the 38th floor conference room, she counted the faces before she sat down. 7 lawyers. 4 of Ethan's board members men. She had met dozens of times at company dinners, men who had shaken her hand and called her lovely and gracious, and other words people use when they can't think of anything real to say about a woman. Ethan's personal assistant Marcus, who had always been polite to her in the careful way of someone who understood exactly where the power in a room lived and was making sure to stay close to it. And Ethan. I was already seated at the head of the table when she walked in. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit she had picked out for him 2 years ago. He didn't look up when she entered. That was new. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe he had stopped looking up when she entered rooms years ago, and she had simply stopped noticing when the moment happened. One of his lawyers, a man named Gerald Finch, whom she had seen at their apartment twice during what Ethan had called business dinners, gestured toward the chair at the far end of the table. Not beside Ethan, not across from him, at the far end. Claire sat down, and that's when she noticed the papers already laid out in front of where she was supposed to sit. Already tabbed, already flagged. Every place she needed to sign already marked with those small adhesive arrows that said in their cheerful efficiency, "This won't take long. We already know how this ends." Her own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Sue, sat beside her and immediately leaned over to whisper something. Claire put her hand gently on Patricia's arm to stop her. "I already read everything," Claire said quietly. Patricia stared at her. "Claire, the settlement figure is, I know what it is. It's insulting. We can fight this. There are grounds for—" "I'm not fighting it." Patricia sat back. She looked at Claire the way people look at someone they're afraid might be in shock, that careful, watchful look that tries to assess whether the calm on someone's face is real or whether it's the kind of calm that breaks without warning. Ethan finally looked up. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for the past 2 years, with an expression that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite indifference, but existed somewhere in the cold geography between them. Like she was a logistical problem he was relieved to finally be resolving. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this," he said. And his tone, God, his tone. The tone of a man who has never once considered that the person across from him might deserve to be spoken to differently. Claire said nothing. One of the board members, a heavy-set man named Douglas Crane, who ran Ethan's West Coast operations, and who had once told her at a gala that she seemed perfectly suited for the life Ethan provides, Douglas Crane actually chuckled. "Smooth process," Douglas said to Ethan, as if Claire wasn't sitting 8 feet away. "Smart woman knowing when not to make a scene." Claire looked at Douglas Crane for exactly 3 seconds. He looked away first. Then Gerald Finch cleared his throat and began laying out the terms. $2 million as a final settlement. The penthouse would go to Ethan as the purchase had been made in his name. No claim on any portion of Crawford Capital Holdings. No continued access to joint accounts. Health insurance through the end of the year, as Gerald said, a gesture of goodwill. The Manhattan storage unit that contained what remained of Claire's personal belongings before the marriage would be released to her immediately. A storage unit. After 10 years. $2 million in a storage unit. Patricia Sue's jaw was visibly tight. She was a woman who had spent 20 years in family law, and Claire suspected she had seen worse settlements, but was offended on principle by the performance of generosity wrapped around what was at its core a deeply contemptuous offer. "Ethan," Patricia began, "given the duration of the marriage and the lifestyle maintained, her name is on exactly nothing in my company," Ethan said. Not rudely, not loudly, just factually, in the way that men who have spent decades being the smartest person in the room sometimes speak as though the conversation is a formality they're tolerating out of social obligation. "She has no legal claim. I'm being generous. The $2 million is more than generous, frankly." "I'd like to speak on behalf of Patricia." Claire's voice was quiet, final. Patricia stopped. Ethan leaned back in his chair. He seemed almost relaxed now, and that relaxation was in itself a kind of cruelty. The ease of a man who had never for a single moment worried about how this day would go for him. "Look," he said, and he looked directly at Claire now for the first time with something approximating emotion, though the emotion was closer to impatience than anything that resembled what should exist between two people who had shared a bed and a life for a decade. "I know this isn't easy, but let's be honest with each other, since we never really managed that during the marriage." A few of the lawyers shifted in their seats. "You had a good life here, a great life. You had access to everything money could provide. But let's not pretend you brought anything to the table in terms of what built this company. I worked, I built, I sacrificed. You were there. That's fine. That was the arrangement. But it's over now, and I think we both know the fair thing is to acknowledge what was actually mine." He gestured at the papers. "Everything I built belongs to me. You were lucky to stand beside me, and now I think we should both be mature enough to acknowledge that and move forward." The room was completely silent. Several people were looking at the table. Douglas Crane was looking at his phone. Patricia Sue was looking at Claire with an expression that contained equal parts outrage and helpless sympathy. Claire picked up the pen. She signed the first page, then the second, then the third. She moved through the document with calm, deliberate efficiency, and the scratching of the pen against paper was the only sound in the room. She did not cry. She did not argue. She did not look at Ethan. When she reached the last page, she signed her name one final time, set the pen down with the faint click of someone who has just completed a task, and pushed the papers back toward Gerald Finch. Then she stood. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. She looked at Ethan Crawford one last time, and this is the moment that Patricia Sue would describe later to her husband at the kitchen table that evening as the strangest thing she had witnessed in 2 decades of divorce law. Because Claire's expression wasn't sad. It wasn't angry. It wasn't the performance of dignity that people put on when they're trying to save face in humiliating situations. It was something else entirely. It was the look of a woman who has just been released from something. "Take care of yourself, Ethan," Claire said, and she walked out. She did not take the elevator. She took the stairs all 38 floors because she needed the physical fact of each step downward to make it real. The sound of her heels on the concrete, the echo in the stairwell, the way her body moved through space in a building she would never enter again. When she pushed through the lobby door and stepped onto the sidewalk, it was raining. Not heavily, just that thin gray November rain that doesn't quite commit to being weather, but saturates everything anyway. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her face turned up toward it, and then she picked up her suitcase and hailed a cab. She gave the driver an address on the Upper West Side, her sister Ellen's apartment where she would stay for the next 2 weeks while she figured out the next step. In the cab, she let herself have exactly 7 minutes. 7 minutes of letting it all exist, the humiliation, the grief, the particular specific heartbreak that comes not from losing a person you love, but from finally accepting that the person you loved never quite existed in the way you believed they did. The mourning of an illusion is its own specific kind of grief, and it has its own weight. She let herself feel it, all of it. And then with the focus and precision of a woman who had been quietly managing enormous things for a very long time, she took out her phone and made a call. It rang twice. "Ms. Hartwell." The voice on the other end was professional, warm, and completely unsurprised to hear from her. "We've been expecting your call." "I know," Claire said. "Schedule a board meeting for Thursday. I'll be in the office Wednesday morning." A pause. Then, "Should I inform the team? Tell them the chairwoman is returning." She hung up. The cab moved through midtown traffic. Outside the windows, Manhattan pulsed and roared with its usual indifference to any individual human drama. People walked fast. Cabs honked. Somewhere ahead, a truck was unloading something. The city continued as it always did, without ceremony. Claire looked out the window, and for the first time in 10 years, she felt something she had almost forgotten the texture of. She felt like herself. Now, to understand why that phone call mattered, to understand what it meant that the woman Ethan Crawford had just dismissed with $2 million and a gesture of contempt had just called a board meeting, you have to go back to before the penthouse, before the marriage, before the decade of silence. You have to go back to Claire Hartwell at 25 years old, sitting in the offices of her grandfather's company 3 weeks after his funeral, listening to a room full of gray-haired men explain to her very patiently, very condescendingly, that she would probably want to consider selling her controlling share of Hartwell Capital Group to someone with more experience in asset management. Her grandfather, Edward Hartwell, had built his empire the slow and brilliant way, starting with a single regional investment fund in the early 1970s and spending 40 years turning it into one of the most quietly powerful private investment groups in the country. He wasn't famous. He didn't give interviews. He didn't attend galas or court the press. He was simply methodically, relentlessly good at understanding where value was hiding before anyone else could see it. And he had passed that gift to Claire, not officially, not through any formal process, but through 20 years of Sunday dinners where he talked about businesses and markets and human behavior, the way other grandfathers talked about sports. Through summers spent in his office watching him read quarterly reports and then close his eyes and sit quietly for a long time before making a decision. Through the habit he gave her of always asking 2 questions about any company before considering it. What does the world think this is worth, and what is it actually worth? When he died, he left her controlling ownership of Hartwell Capital Group, a portfolio of companies' real estate holdings and investment funds worth at the time just over $11 billion. Claire was 25 years old. The board wanted her gone before the body was cold. What happened instead was one of the quietest corporate power moves in the history of New York finance, which is saying something because New York finance has witnessed some extraordinary performances of power. Claire spent 6 months doing nothing. She came to the office. She read everything. She asked questions that seemed naive and were not. She watched the board, watched the senior fund managers, watched who deferred to whom and why and when, watched where the real decisions were made versus where they were announced. And then at the end of those 6 months, she fired 3 board members, restructured 2 major fund holdings, recruited a new CFO from Singapore, and closed a deal that her grandfather's team had been struggling to complete for over a year. After that, no one suggested she should consider selling. She ran Hartwell Capital with a precision and instinct that astonished the people around her, though she was careful about how visible that astonishment ever became. Because the other thing she learned very early was that the financial world had a particular and persistent difficulty accepting brilliance in a woman who was also young and also beautiful. And the way it resolved that difficulty was usually to find another explanation for the success. Luck, good advisors, a brilliant team, the legacy infrastructure her grandfather built. Any explanation except the obvious one. So Claire made herself easy to underestimate. She kept her profile low. She kept Hartwell Capital out of the financial press as much as possible. She did not seek recognition, did not court celebrity, did not build a personal brand. She ran the company with extraordinary skill and protected it with extraordinary privacy. And then she met Ethan Crawford. She met him at a charity benefit, one of those events in Midtown Manhattan where very wealthy people gathered to spend money in public as a way of also doing something good with it. He was 31 to her 27. He was charming, funny, shockingly direct in a room full of people performing elaborate indirectness. He saw her across a crowded room and walked toward her without hesitating, which was either confidence or arrogance, and she hadn't yet learned to tell the difference. "You look like someone who'd rather be somewhere else," he said. "I'm having a perfectly nice time," she said. "No, you're not. Neither am I. But I've been told I'm supposed to shake at least 40 hands tonight, so I'm running out the clock. What's your excuse?" She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh. They talked for 2 hours at that benefit. He walked her to her car afterward, a late October night with leaves skittering across the sidewalk, and he asked for her number with the directness that she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through the world. He did not know who she was. Not really. He knew her name. He knew she worked in finance, which she mentioned only vaguely. He did not connect the name Hartwell to any corporate entity, because Hartwell Capital was deliberately, methodically kept below the radar of most financial press. And Claire, for reasons she would spend years examining, made a decision. She would not tell him. Not right away. She wanted to know if he would love her. Just her. Claire the person, not Claire the heiress, not Claire the financial prodigy, not Claire the owner of $11 billion in assets. She had dated men who found out about Hartwell Capital and immediately changed. Subtly. Gradually. The way light changes in a room when someone opens a door, everything's still there but different. She didn't want different, so she waited. And Ethan pursued her with a genuine intensity that felt like being chosen, which was not something Claire Hartwell had experienced very often, despite or perhaps because of everything she possessed. They dated for 2 years. He never knew. She kept her professional life compartmentalized with a discipline that would have impressed a CIA operative. Different circles, different phone contacts, different social contexts. He proposed on a rainy Tuesday evening in his apartment with her favorite takeout on the counter and a ring that he had clearly picked out with tremendous care, and she said yes. Standing in that apartment looking at his face, genuinely happy, genuinely present in that moment, in a way she had not yet learned, he was not always capable of sustaining. She had thought, "I will tell him after the wedding. When it's settled. When we're a unit, and it won't change how he sees us." She didn't tell him after the wedding, because 3 weeks after the wedding, Ethan's company hit a catastrophic cash flow crisis that threatened to collapse a deal he'd been building for 18 months. He was beside himself, stressed in a way she hadn't seen before, sharp-edged in a new way that she told herself was just the pressure. She helped him, not directly, carefully. She arranged through intermediaries for the right investment to appear at the right moment through a third-party firm with no visible connection to Hartwell Capital. She gave him advice framed as her instincts from reading about similar situations. She connected him casually at a dinner party with a Hong Kong banker who happened to be in the city and who happened to have exactly the capital access Ethan needed. The deal closed. Ethan was ecstatic. He told everyone it was his best piece of negotiating in his career. Claire told no one what she had actually done. She told herself she would tell him eventually. That there would be a right moment, a right conversation where she could explain everything, the company, the ownership, the decade of strategic invisibility, in a way that wouldn't make him feel deceived. The right moment never came, because something else happened instead. Ethan started changing. It was so gradual she almost didn't track it. The success of that first deal, then the next, then the next. Each one built partly on the invisible architecture of Claire's advice and connections and strategic thinking, made him larger in a way that made her smaller. Not immediately, not obviously, but progressively. He started speaking at dinners when she was already speaking. He started making social decisions without consulting her. He started describing her to new acquaintances as, "My wife, she doesn't really work," in that dismissive shorthand that erases a person's interior life with 5 words. She tried talking to him about it, twice. Both times he apologized in the sincere but shallow way of a man who understands that an apology is required but hasn't quite grasped what he's apologizing for. And then the behavior continued. And then the 3rd year became the 4th. The 4th became the 5th. Each year she told herself she was still waiting for the right moment to tell him about Hartwell Capital. Each year she continued helping him quietly and visibly solving problems he didn't know she was solving. Each year he became a little more certain that he had built everything himself. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, somewhere between year 5 and year 7, she couldn't identify the exact moment he stopped seeing her. Not in the dramatic way of affairs and confrontations and slammed doors. In the quieter, more devastating way of simply failing to look. She became furniture. Pleasant, well-maintained, appropriately placed furniture in the elaborate house of his success. She stayed for longer than she should have because she loved him, or she loved the man she had believed him to be in those 2 years before the wedding, and she kept waiting with a patience that she now understood had not been virtue, but avoidance for that man to return. He didn't return. By year 9, she knew it was over. By year 10, he confirmed it. He came home one evening in January and told her with the brisk efficiency of someone delivering a quarterly report that he thought the marriage had run its course and that he had already spoken to his legal team. He had spoken to his legal team before he spoke to her. She sat with that for a long time after he left the room, and she made her decision. She would not tell him. Not now, not during the divorce, not in that conference room. She would let him believe what he had always believed, that she was nothing, that she had contributed nothing, that everything was his. She would let him have that belief for a little while longer. Because Claire Hartwell Crawford had spent 10 years learning the difference between what the world thinks something is worth and what it is actually worth. And she knew with this quiet and absolute certainty of her grandfather's granddaughter that the truth had a way of presenting itself eventually. You didn't have to force it. You just had to be ready to stand in the room when it did. She carried her suitcase out of the building that Tuesday morning, stepped into the rain, and called her board. And the rest of the world, the lawyers, the board members, Douglas Crane with his phone, Ethan Crawford in his charcoal suit, went back to their lives completely certain that the story was over. They couldn't have been more wrong. It was just beginning. Ellen Hartwell heard the knock at her apartment door at 11:47 in the morning, and when she opened it and saw her sister standing there in a navy dress with rain on her shoulders and one suitcase at her feet, she didn't say anything for a full 3 seconds. Then she said, "Come in." That was Ellen. She had always known when words helped and when they didn't. Claire stepped inside and set the suitcase by the door and sat down on the couch, and Ellen went to the kitchen and came back with 2 mugs of tea without asking, because she had been making Claire tea during difficult moments since they were children, and some habits are so deep they become instinct. They sat together for a long time without speaking. Finally, Ellen said, "How bad was it?" Claire wrapped both hands around the mug. "He threw the papers at me in front of everyone." Ellen's jaw tightened. "Tell me you mean he slid them across the table dramatically." "I mean he threw them. They hit my face." The silence that followed that sentence had a particular quality, the silence of a woman trying very hard not to say 17 things simultaneously. "And you signed?" Ellen said. "I signed." "Claire, Ellen, you have $38 billion. I know what I have. He gave you $2 million and a storage unit. I know. And you just..." Ellen stopped, set her mug down, looked at her sister with the focused intensity of someone trying to understand a decision that seems from the outside completely incomprehensible. "Why help me understand why? Because from where I'm sitting, you just let that man walk away believing he won." Claire looked at her sister for a long moment. "He did win," she said. "Today." Ellen started to speak. "But today," Claire said quietly, "is not the whole story." Ellen stared at her, and then very slowly something shifted in her expression, not understanding exactly, but the beginning of it. The recognition that her sister, who had always been 3 moves ahead of every room she walked into, was 3 moves ahead of this one too. "Thursday," Claire said. "I have a board meeting Thursday." Ellen picked up her mug again. "How long has it been since you ran the company yourself?" "Actively 7 years. They've been waiting. They've been patient." Claire said. "There's a difference." Ellen nodded slowly. Then she said something she had been holding for years, something she had bitten back at family dinners and holiday gatherings, and every occasion where she had watched her brilliant, extraordinary sister make herself small to fit inside the shape of Ethan Crawford's life. "I never told you this," Ellen said, "but I hated watching what that marriage did to you. Not because he was cruel in obvious ways, because he was cruel in the way that's hardest to name. He made you feel like you were less, every single year a little less. And you let him because you loved him, and I understood that, but I hated it." Claire was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said finally. "You're not less." "I know that too." Claire looked down at her tea. "I forgot it for a while. That's the honest answer. I forgot it." She didn't say anything else about it that night, but Ellen watched her sister sit up a little straighter on that couch, watched something settle back into place behind her eyes, something quiet and certain, and underneath the exhaustion of the day, something that looked unmistakably like resolve. The next morning, Claire woke at 5:15, same as always. She went for a walk. She moved through the Upper West Side streets in the early gray of the morning coffee from a corner deli in hand, and she let herself think about what came next, with the same methodical clarity she had applied to every major decision of her professional life. The situation at Hartwell Capital was this for 7 years. She had remained the chairwoman and controlling owner, but had taken a deliberately passive role in daily operations. The company had continued performing well. Her grandfather's foundational structures were sound, and she had hired excellent people, but it had not grown at the pace it could have. It had been managed, not driven. That was about to change. She called James Whitfield at 7 in the morning. He was her COO, had been for 4 years, and she had hired him specifically because he was brilliant, and because he had the particular qualities she prized most in the people around her. He did not need to be the most important person in the room in order to do excellent work. He picked up on the first ring. "Ms. Hartwell, good morning." "James, I want a full portfolio review on my desk before Thursday's meeting. Everything underperforming assets, new acquisition targets, the Singapore situation, and the pending offer from Meridian Group." A pause. "The Meridian offer, you want to revisit that? I want to make a decision on it Thursday." Another pause, longer this time. James Whitfield was a man who understood subtext. He had worked for Claire long enough to understand that when she said she was ready to make a decision on something, she had usually already made it. "I'll have everything ready," he said. "One more thing," Claire said. "Yes. Tell the team I'm coming back, not in the cautious way. Tell them directly. The chairwoman is resuming active leadership." She heard what sounded like a carefully suppressed exhale of relief. "I will absolutely tell them that," James said. "And Ms. Hartwell, for what it's worth, I speak for the entire senior team when I say we're glad." She said thank you and hung up and kept walking. By the time she got back to Ellen's apartment, she had made 6 more calls. Wednesday morning. Claire walked into the offices of Hartwell Capital Group for the first time in 7 years in an active capacity, and she felt the shift in the building before she was through the lobby. It moved through the space the way weather moves through air. People straightened, voices changed, register. A particular attention snapped into focus that hadn't been there the day before. Her executive assistant, a young woman named Diane, who had been with the company for 3 years and had therefore never worked directly with Claire in an active role, met her in the lobby with a tablet and a look of barely contained nerves. "Good morning, Ms. Hartwell. Your calendar is..." "Diane." Claire said it warmly but clearly. "Walk with me and talk to me like we've been doing this for years, because we're about to be doing this for years." Diane blinked, then nodded, then did exactly that. In the first 4 hours of that Wednesday, Claire reviewed the complete state of Hartwell Capital's portfolio, met with 4 department heads, terminated a vendor contract that had been hemorrhaging money for 2 years because nobody had wanted to be the one to make the call, and identified 3 acquisition targets that her senior investment team had been cautious about, but that she, after 40 minutes of analysis, believed were significantly undervalued. Her senior fund manager, a 15-year veteran named Robert Chen, who had known her grandfather, sat across from her during the afternoon review session with an expression. She recognized the expression of a man watching someone do something that looks almost effortless, but that he knows from experience is extraordinarily difficult. "The Delacroix portfolio," she said, pointing at a specific line item in the analysis. "Why are we still holding..." Robert cleared his throat. "The board felt it was a stable if low-performing asset, and with the overall..." It's not stable, Robert. It's stagnant. There's a difference. She looked at him directly. What do you think? He looked slightly startled. He had not been asked what he thought in some time, she suspected. Honestly, I think we should have exited 18 months ago. Then we exit, put together the divestment strategy, and have it ready for Thursday. He nodded. Then after a beat, he said something quiet. Your grandfather would be pleased, Ms. Hartwell, genuinely. Claire looked at him for a moment. Thank you, Robert. That means something to me. Thursday's board meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, Hartwell Capital had a new strategic direction, 3 pending acquisitions, a divestment plan for 2 underperforming assets, and a confirmed expansion into the European private equity market that Claire had been watching and waiting on for 2 years. The board members who had spent 7 years running the company without her active presence sat around the table in various states of recalibration. None of them were unhappy. Several of them were visibly energized in the way that people become energized when someone with genuine vision walks back into a room and reminds them why they came to work in the first place. At the end of the meeting, the eldest board member, a woman named Margaret Ewan, who had served on the Hartwell board since Claire's grandfather's time, and who was the only person in the organization who had ever spoken to Claire with the kind of directness that doesn't require softening, leaned over and said quietly, "What took you so long?" Claire smiled. I was trying to save something that couldn't be saved. Margaret nodded once. And now I'm done trying. Meanwhile, 2 blocks south and 40 floors up, Ethan Crawford was having a different kind of week. He had announced the morning after the divorce was finalized that he was introducing his girlfriend Alexandra to his professional circle. Alexandra was 31, worked in luxury brand development, was photogenic and socially skilled, and possessed the kind of confident ease in expensive rooms that read from a distance as sophistication. Ethan had posted a photograph on his professional social media, the two of them, at a restaurant, her hand on his arm, his expression the particular expression of a man who wants to appear happy and is working at it. The comments were congratulatory. Of course they were. They always were. But in the private conversations, the texts between board members, the calls between investors, the quiet exchanges at the club and in the elevator and overworking lunches, a different conversation was happening. Because a thing had shifted in the 3 days since the divorce. It had started, of all places, with Douglas Crane. Douglas Crane, who had chuckled in that conference room. Douglas Crane, who had looked at his phone while Ethan humiliated his wife of 10 years. Douglas Crane had gone home that Tuesday evening and mentioned the divorce to his wife Helen over dinner in the casual way of someone relaying an office anecdote, and Helen Crane had put down her fork. Claire Crawford, Helen said. Yes. Claire Crawford, who was at the Whitmore Foundation Gala 3 years ago, the one who spent 40 minutes talking to Senator Reeves about infrastructure investment policy. I suppose I don't remember specifically. Douglas. Helen's voice had a quality he had learned over 28 years of marriage to pay attention to. Did you know who her family is? He had not known, or rather he had known her name was Hartwell before she married Crawford, and he had filed that away without connecting the dots, which in retrospect seemed extraordinary, but was in fact completely understandable, because Claire had spent years making sure the dots were not easily connected. Helen pulled up something on her phone and set it on the table in front of him. It was a financial publication profile from 9 years ago. Small piece barely noticed at the time. The headline read, Hartwell Capital's Quiet New Chairwoman Surprises Industry with Aggressive Q4 Strategy. The photograph in the article was Claire, 8 years younger, but unmistakably Claire. Douglas Crane stared at that photograph for a very long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Gerald Finch. By the next morning, Gerald Finch had called 2 other lawyers. Those 2 lawyers had each called someone. The information moved the way information moves in tight financial circles. Not like gossip, which runs fast and loud, but like a slow tide, quiet and comprehensive, reaching everywhere eventually. By Thursday, the question being whispered in exactly the right corners of New York's financial world was this: how much of Crawford Capital's success over the past decade had been built on advice and access provided by a woman whose own asset base dwarfed her husband's entire company? Nobody had an answer yet. But the question itself was enough. On Friday morning, Ethan was in his office preparing for the IPO roadshow when Marcus knocked and entered with the specific expression of someone delivering news they would rather not deliver. There's something you should see, Marcus said, and he placed a printout on Ethan's desk. It was a brief item from a financial newsletter, not a major outlet, a mid-tier industry publication, but one read carefully by exactly the kind of people whose attention mattered. The headline said, Hartwell Capital's long-absent chairwoman returns to active leadership, sources indicate major strategic expansion ahead. Beneath it, a single paragraph noting that Claire Hartwell Crawford, controlling owner and chairwoman of Hartwell Capital Group, had resumed active leadership of the firm following her recent divorce and was expected to announce significant new investment initiatives in coming months. Ethan read it twice. The name Hartwell Capital landed in his brain with the delayed impact of something that has always been there, but that you have never looked at directly. Marcus, he said carefully, what is Hartwell Capital's current valuation? Marcus, who had clearly already looked this up, said, conservative estimates put it between $35 and $40 billion. The room was very quiet. And Claire? Ethan started again. Claire Hartwell, what is her ownership stake? Controlling interest, Marcus said. She inherited it at 25. Her grandfather founded the group. Ethan put the paper down on the desk. He thought about the dinner parties where he had described her as, she doesn't really work. He thought about the conference room, the papers hitting her face, the speech he had given to a room full of people about how everything he built belonged to him. And then he thought about something else. He thought about every financial crisis Crawford Capital had navigated in the past 10 years. Every deal that had come together against the odds, every investor introduction that had appeared at exactly the right moment. Every piece of advice Claire had offered casually, almost offhandedly over dinner or during a quiet Sunday morning, that he had implemented and taken credit for so completely that he had eventually convinced himself he had originated the idea. He sat with that for a long time. Marcus was still standing in the doorway. Close the door, Ethan said. He sat alone in his office for 45 minutes. His assistant knocked twice and he didn't answer. His phone rang 4 times and he let it ring. He was doing the math. And the math, once he started doing it honestly, which was possibly the first time he had done anything about Claire honestly in years, was devastating. Not just financially, though financially it was catastrophic. The discovery that the woman he had discarded had more personal wealth than his entire company was worth was not a small thing. But something else was unraveling too. The story he had told himself. The narrative of Ethan Crawford, self-made brilliant, the architect of his own extraordinary success. That story had felt true. It had felt true because he had told it so many times, and because everyone around him had confirmed it, and because Claire had never, not once, contradicted it. And now he understood why she had never contradicted it. Not because it was true, because she had chosen not to. And that distinction, the space between cannot and chose not to, was where the full weight of what he had done finally landed on him. He had not simply underestimated her. He had dismissed someone who could have destroyed his credibility at any point during their marriage, and she had protected him anyway. She had protected him for 10 years. She had helped him. She had fixed his mistakes. She had connected him with the right people at the right moments. She had sat quietly through dinners where he described her as having no real work, and she had said nothing. Not because she was weak, because she loved him. And he had thrown papers at her face in a conference room and told her she was lucky to have stood beside him. His phone buzzed. It was Alexandra asking if they were still on for dinner. He looked at the message for a moment. Then he put the phone face down on the desk. I didn't call Claire. He wasn't ready for that. And somewhere beneath the shock and the math and the unraveling narrative, he understood that calling her was not something he had any right to do. Not today. Possibly not ever. What he did instead was sit with what he had done. It was an unfamiliar posture for Ethan Crawford, sitting with what he had done. He was a man of action, a man who moved forward, who treated the past as useful only insofar as it informed the next move. He was not built for stillness, but he sat there anyway, because some reckonings don't let you move until you've sat inside them long enough to understand what they're made of. 2 weeks after the board meeting, Claire sat across from a journalist named Catherine Bell at a small restaurant near the Hartwell Capital offices. Catherine wrote for a respected financial publication, not the gossip press, not the tabloids, the kind of publication where the readers were the people who made decisions about where enormous amounts of money moved. Claire had agreed to one interview. One. She had specific things she wanted to say, and she would say them, and then she would go back to work. Catherine had done her research. She was sharp, thorough, and had the excellent journalist's gift of appearing to ask simple questions that were actually complex. You ran this company quietly for years, Catherine said. Very quietly by any measure. Why the low profile? I had reasons that felt valid at the time, Claire said. Some of them still do. Some of them I've reconsidered. The divorce was public in the sense that Ethan Crawford's divorce made financial news. Were you anticipating the level of attention that followed? I was anticipating some attention, Claire said. I wasn't concerned about it. There are people in the industry who are now asking questions about the past decade of Crawford Capital specifically, about how much of its success might be attributable to your involvement. How do you respond to that? Claire considered the question carefully. I supported my husband, she said, in the ways that I could. I'm not going to characterize that support further, and I'm not going to use this conversation to relitigate a marriage. She paused. What I will say is that I am focused on the future of Hartwell Capital, what we build from this point forward. That's the only story I'm interested in telling. Catherine looked at her for a moment. That's a very controlled answer. Yes, Claire agreed. Catherine smiled. Fair enough. She shifted. What does the expansion look like? The rumors are significant. And this Claire leaned into. Because the work, the real work, was where she came alive in a way that nothing else had ever quite replicated. She talked about the European strategy, the 3 acquisitions, the new fund structure she was developing that would target mid-market companies with strong fundamentals and poor access to growth capital. She talked for 20 minutes without stopping. And Catherine Bell, who had interviewed some of the most powerful financial figures in the country, sat across from her with a recorder running and the particular expression of a journalist who realizes they are witnessing something genuinely significant. The article ran 12 days later. The headline, Claire Hartwell Crawford, the billionaire who built her empire in silence. It ran 4,000 words. It included a photograph of Claire at her desk, not posed, not performative, just working the way she always worked with absolute focus. It detailed the history of Hartwell Capital, her grandfather's legacy, her own extraordinary record of leadership, and the strategic vision she was now pursuing, without restraint or invisibility. It did not mention Ethan Crawford by name. It didn't need to. The industry read it in a single morning. And by afternoon, Ethan's phone had received 11 messages from investors, 3 calls from board members, and 1 very short email from his most significant institutional partner that contained 5 words he had never received before in his professional life. We need to talk, this week. He read that email standing in his kitchen at 6 in the evening, and he stood there for a long time before he put the phone down. Alexandra came into the kitchen and asked what was wrong. He said nothing. But he looked at her, and for the first time since the divorce, he saw her clearly, not as someone he had chosen, not as a validation of anything, but simply as a person who was standing in his kitchen, not knowing that the ground beneath everything had fundamentally shifted. I need to go make some calls, he said. She watched him leave the room. And Ethan Crawford, for the first time in 10 years, did not know what the next move was. Meanwhile, in her new apartment 3 miles away, Claire Hartwell, Crawford sat at her desk at 10:30 in the evening, reading through an acquisition proposal for a logistics company in Nashville that her team believed was significantly undervalued. She had a glass of water. She had a legal pad covered in her own handwriting. She had the quiet of a space that was entirely and only hers. Her phone lit up with the message from Ellen. Did you see the article comments women are losing their minds in the best way? Claire smiled. She typed back, I saw. Back to work. Ellen responded with a string of heart emojis. Claire put the phone down and returned to the proposal. Outside, the city moved and breathed and continued doing what it always did. But inside that room, something was building, not with noise or drama, not with any of the performance that Ethan Crawford had always mistaken for significance. Quietly, methodically, with absolute precision, the way Edward Hartwell had taught his granddaughter to build, the way she had always done it. And this time, nothing and no one was going to make her small again. The invitation arrived 6 weeks after the Catherine Bell article ran, and it arrived not by email but by formal courier, a thick cream envelope with the seal of the Meridian Financial Summit embossed in navy blue on the back flap. Claire was in a meeting when Diane brought it in. She set it on the corner of the desk without interrupting, and Claire glanced at it, finished the point she was making to her acquisitions team, and then picked it up and opened it while the team continued talking around her. The Meridian Financial Summit, Chicago, the largest gathering of institutional investors, private equity leaders, and financial industry executives in the country, held once a year. Keynote speakers were not invited. They were selected through a process that involved more political maneuvering than most Senate confirmations. She had been selected as the closing keynote speaker. She read the invitation a second time. Then she set it down and rejoined the conversation happening in her conference room as though nothing had occurred, and it wasn't until the team had filed out and Diane was clearing coffee cups that Claire said very calmly, "Block the third weekend of next month, all of it." Diane looked up. "The Chicago Summit." "You already knew. The summit director called James last week to confirm your availability before sending the formal invitation." Diane paused. "James told them yes." Claire looked at her. "James told them yes before asking me." "James told them," Diane said carefully, "that he was confident you would say yes." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was right, but tell him I'd prefer to be consulted." "I will absolutely tell him that," Diane said, and her tone suggested that she would do so with some pleasure. That evening Claire called Ellen. "Chicago," Ellen said immediately when Claire told her. "The Meridian Summit." "Claire, do you understand how big that is?" "I understand. Ethan is going to be there, his IPO announcement, the whole thing." Claire had known this before Ellen said it. She had known it the moment she read the invitation and seen the date. She had said nothing to Diane, nothing to James, nothing to anyone. She had simply made a note of it in her own mind and set it aside to sit with. "I know," she said, "and you're still going." "Of course I'm still going." Ellen made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite something else. "You have always been the most terrifying person I know," she said, "and I mean that as the highest compliment." Claire smiled. "Get some sleep." She hung up and sat for a while in the quiet of her apartment. The city hummed outside. She thought about Chicago. She thought about Ethan standing in that ballroom preparing to announce the biggest moment of his professional life. She thought about what it would mean to walk through those doors. She had not engineered this. That was the thing she wanted to be clear about, at least to herself. She had not maneuvered to be at the summit, had not orchestrated the timing, had not designed the collision. The invitation was real and independent, and she had accepted it for the same reason she would have accepted it at any other point in her career, because Hartwell Capital's presence on that stage mattered for the company and the people who worked there. But she would be lying to herself if she pretended she didn't understand what her presence in that room would mean. She understood completely. 3 weeks before the summit, Ethan Crawford's IPO roadshow was generating enormous buzz in exactly the circles where buzz translated directly into capital. The numbers looked strong. The narrative was clean decade of growth visionary leadership now going public at the peak of performance. His PR team had constructed the story with the precision of people who understood that an IPO was as much theater as finance, and Ethan himself was performing it brilliantly. He was charming, confident, and commanded a room in the way that had always been his most genuine talent. But underneath the performance something was eroding. It had started with the institutional partner meeting, the one that had been requested in that 5-word email. Ethan had gone into that meeting with a private equity group that represented a significant anchor investment for the IPO, expecting to deliver his usual roadshow presentation. Instead, he sat down across from 4 partners who had clearly done a great deal of reading in the past 3 weeks. The lead partner, a woman named Susan Park, who had been in private equity for 25 years and did not waste words, had opened by saying, "We want to talk about the advisory structure at Crawford Capital over the past decade." Ethan said, "Of course, I'm happy to walk you through our internal teams." "That's not what I mean," Susan Park said. "I'm asking about informal advisory relationships, external expertise that may have contributed to significant decision points." The room was quiet. "We make decisions internally," Ethan said. His voice was perfectly controlled. His face was perfectly controlled. "The team I've built is exceptional." "The decision to enter the Pacific Rim manufacturing sector in 2017, Susan said, and she opened a folder. "The restructuring of the Kellerman acquisition in 2019, the timing of the Northbrook exit in 2021. She looked up from the folder. "We've been doing some research, Ethan, and we're finding a pattern of timing and strategic insight that is," she chose the word carefully, "notable, given what we now know about your former wife's background." Ethan said nothing for 4 seconds. He counted them. "Those decisions reflect the work of my leadership team," he said. "I'm not sure what pattern you believe you're seeing." Susan Park closed the folder. "We're not withdrawing our interest in the IPO," she said, "but we're adjusting our preliminary commitment figure while we complete additional due diligence." She said what the adjusted figure was. It was 40% lower than the original commitment. Ethan drove back to his office from that meeting and did not speak to anyone for the remainder of the afternoon. Marcus knocked at 5 o'clock with a stack of messages. 3 other investors had called requesting additional information about Crawford Capital's internal decision-making structure and the composition of its advisory relationships. "Tell them I'll follow up personally," Ethan said. "There's also something else," Marcus said. "What?" Marcus set a printout on the desk. It was a social media post, not from a financial publication, but from a former employee of Crawford Capital, an analyst who had left the company 4 years ago. The post had been up for 6 hours and had already been shared several hundred times within financial industry circles. It read, "Worked at Crawford Capital for 3 years. Watched multiple major strategy pivots get announced as Ethan's vision that we all knew came from outside consultation. The Catherine Bell piece made me finally understand where that consultation was coming from. Wild that it took a divorce for the truth to surface." The post didn't name Claire explicitly. It didn't need to. Ethan stared at it for a long time. Then he said, "Find out if this person is still under NDA." Marcus said very carefully, "They're not." Ethan nodded. "Close the door on your way out." He sat alone and he thought about what was happening and what was going to keep happening and whether there was a way to stop it. His PR team could manage individual narratives. They could push back on specific claims. They could control the story in the financial press to a significant degree. But they couldn't control the truth. And the truth was that the people who mattered, the institutional investors, the board members, the industry insiders, who had been around long enough to recognize what competence actually looked like, those people were doing the math. Quietly, methodically, the way people in finance always did the most important calculations. And the math kept producing the same answer. The question was no longer whether they were asking. The question was, how long before the asking became loud? 2 weeks before Chicago, Claire was reviewing the final structure of her keynote when James came into her office with an expression she had learned meant he was about to say something he had been rehearsing. "The summit committee called," he said. "They wanted to confirm the order of the program. And Ethan Crawford is delivering the midday address, his IPO announcement." "I know." James looked at her. "You knew before I told you." "Yes." "And you didn't mention it." "No." He stood there for a moment processing this. This isn't about him, is it? The keynote, the timing." "The keynote is about Hartwell Capital," Claire said. "It has always been about Hartwell Capital." "But you understood what it would look like." "James," she looked up from the document, "what it looks like and what it is are 2 different things. I know the difference. I need the people in that room to know it too." James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" "Make sure the presentation is flawless," she said. "Every number checked twice, every slide clean and direct, no overproduction, just the work." "Done," he said. "Anything else?" "Yes." She leaned back. "Tell Robert I want the full Hartwell Capital historical performance data included. 15 years, every major decision point. I want the record to speak for itself." James nodded slowly. He was understanding something. "You're not going to attack him." "I was never going to attack him. You're just going to show what you built." "I'm going to show what Hartwell Capital built," she said. "Yes." He nodded once more and left. And this was the thing that nobody except Ellen and perhaps Margaret Ewan fully understood about Claire's strategy. If it could be called a strategy, it was not revenge. It had never been revenge. Revenge requires the other person to be the point. And Ethan Crawford had been the point of Claire's life for 10 years, and she was done with that. She was done organizing her existence around him, even in opposition. What she was doing in Chicago was simply standing up, fully, for the first time, without making herself smaller to accommodate anyone else's comfort. That was all. That was everything. The morning of the summit, Claire was in her hotel suite at 5:15. She made coffee from the in-room machine and stood at the window and breathed. She thought about her grandfather, which she often did in important moments. She thought about the Sunday dinners and the quarterly reports and the question he had taught her to always ask. What does the world think this is worth, and what is it actually worth? She had spent 10 years being worth far more than the world than one specific man believed. Today, the 2 numbers would align. She dressed with care, not armor, not performance, just the natural precision of a woman who understood that how you presented yourself in a room told people something before you opened your mouth, and what she wanted to say before she spoke a word was, "I am entirely comfortable taking up every inch of this space." Dark green dress, her grandmother's pearl earrings, her hair down. She looked exactly like herself. Diane knocked at 7:30 and came in with a coffee from the lobby and a look of barely suppressed electricity. "How are you?" Diane asked. "Ready," Claire said. "The room holds 1,200 people," Diane said. "It's at capacity." "Good. There are cameras from 4 financial news networks." "Good." Diane hesitated. Then, "He's already here. Crawford. He arrived last night. His PR team has been everywhere." Claire sipped her coffee. "That's fine." "People are talking," Diane said. "In the lobby at breakfast. Everyone knows you're both here. The energy is—" She searched for the word significant. "Let them talk," Claire said. "That's what lobbies are for." She arrived at the summit venue at 8:45. The midday session, Ethan's session, was at 11. Her keynote was at 3. In the hours between, she attended 2 panel discussions, spoke with 4 institutional investors she had been cultivating relationships with for the past month, and had a brief hallway conversation with Senator Patricia Reeves, who had known her grandfather, and who gripped Claire's hand with both of hers and said, "I read the Bell article 3 times. Your grandfather would be furious it took this long for the world to see you properly." "He would have found a diplomatic way to say that," Claire said. "Edward Hartwell was many things," the senator said. "Diplomatic was not the primary one." Claire laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that felt like something loosening in her chest. At 10:55, she found a seat in the back of the main ballroom for Ethan's address. She had considered not attending. She had gone back and forth on it. In the end, she decided to attend because avoiding it would feel like hiding, and she was done hiding. The room filled quickly. 1,200 people finding seats with the particular energy of an audience that understands they are about to witness something that has acquired, for various reasons, additional weight. Ethan walked onto the stage at 11 exactly. He looked good. He always looked good in front of a crowd. It was perhaps his most authentic gift, this ability to walk into a room full of people and make each of them feel briefly that he was speaking directly to them. He was in a charcoal suit, not the one she had picked out, a different one. His posture was excellent. His opening was confident and warm. He did not see her in the back of the room, or if he did, he didn't let it show. He delivered the IPO address with skill. The numbers were strong. The narrative was clean. The vision for Crawford Capital's next chapter was articulated with the forceful clarity that had always been his strength. The room responded well, applause at the right moments, leaning forward in the right moments, the body language of an audience being persuaded. Claire watched. She kept her face neutral and her attention complete. She listened to every word, and she noticed what wasn't there. Not in the speech itself, the speech was technically excellent, but in the room, in the responses of the people around her who knew what she knew, who had read what they had read in the past 6 weeks. There was a quality to the applause that was slightly different from what it would have been 2 months ago. Still strong, but not unanimous in the way it would once have been. Several of the institutional investors she recognized sat with their arms unfolded, but their expressions carefully neutral, in the manner of people who are evaluating rather than celebrating. The standing ovation at the end was real, but not complete. 3 months ago, it would have been complete. She slipped out before the Q&A. The 3 hours between Ethan's address and her keynote were the quietest hours of the day. She went back to a green room the summit had arranged, reviewed her notes one final time, ate half a sandwich that Diane brought her, and did the thing she always did before major presentations. She sat in silence for 15 minutes and did nothing except breathe and think about the work. Not the audience, not the room, not Ethan Crawford on a stage 2 hours before her, just the work. At 2:55, James knocked. "They're ready for you." She stood, straightened, looked at him. 15 years of the best performance data in private equity, he said. "Everything's on those slides. The record speaks for itself." "It always has," she said. "It just needed a larger room." She walked toward the stage. The moderator was a financial journalist named David Hale, whom she had met twice before. He was standing at the side of the stage with a look of genuine anticipation that told her the room was alive in a way that went beyond ordinary summit energy. 1,200 people, he said quietly. And I'll be honest, there are another 300 who couldn't get seats who are watching on the screens in the lobby." "Then I'll speak loudly," she said. He smiled. "Ms. Hartwell, it's genuinely an honor." She nodded, took a breath, and David Hale walked to the podium and said into the microphone to 1,200 people and an unknown number of cameras, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Claire Hartwell, Crawford chairwoman and majority owner of Hartwell Capital Group, currently valued at over $38 billion. The doors opened. Claire walked in. The response was immediate, and it was not polite applause. It was the sound of a room that had been anticipating this moment, and was now releasing that anticipation in a single wave of recognition and energy. People rose. Not everyone and not immediately, but the standing ovation built from the front of the room and moved backward like a tide. And by the time she reached the podium, it was complete. 1,200 people on their feet. She stood at the podium and looked out at the room and waited calmly for the sound to settle. In the 4th row, she could see Douglas Crane. His face had a complicated expression she chose not to interpret. In the 7th row, she could see 2 of Ethan's board members. They were on their feet, but their faces were doing something difficult. And in the far right section, partially obscured by a pillar, she could see Ethan Crawford himself. He had stayed. She had not expected that. Or perhaps she had not allowed herself to expect it. But he was there standing because the room was standing, his hands together in what was technically applause. His face stripped of every performance, every practiced expression, every layer of the man she had watched construct and maintain his public self for 10 years. What was underneath all of that was something she had not seen on his face in a very long time. It was recognition. Real recognition, the kind that arrives too late and knows it. She looked at him for 1 second. Not longer. Then she looked at the room. "Thank you," she said, and her voice through the microphone was steady and clear and completely her own. "I want to talk to you today about what value actually looks like, not what we're told it looks like. Not the version that gets applauded in rooms like this one, the real version, the kind that exists whether or not anyone is watching." The room was absolutely silent. 15 years ago, she continued, my grandfather sat across from me at his kitchen table and told me the only question worth asking about any business was this: what does the world think it's worth and what is it actually worth? He told me those 2 numbers are almost never the same. And he told me that the entire art of what we do, the art of real investment, real value creation, is learning to see the difference. She paused. I spent the first part of my career building something. I spent the middle part of my career being invisible. And I spent the last 3 months remembering that those 2 numbers, what the world thinks you're worth and what you actually are worth, are almost never the same. The silence in the room had the quality of 1,200 people choosing not to breathe. "Let me show you what Hartwell Capital has built," she said, "and let me show you where we are going." The first slide appeared behind her. 15 years of performance data, every major decision point, every return figure, every acquisition and divestment and fund structure that had been built quietly and methodically over a decade and a half. The numbers were extraordinary, not by the standards of the financial press, which had barely covered Hartwell Capital, by the objective standard of what the numbers were. She heard the sound move through the room, not a gasp, not applause, but something more like the collective recalibration of 1,200 financial professionals simultaneously updating their understanding of what they were looking at. She walked them through it. 15 years of decisions explained not with the theater of a performer, but with the precision of someone who understood every single one of them down to the molecular level because she had made every single one of them. She spoke for 40 minutes. Not one person in that room looked at their phone. When she finished, the applause was different from Ethan's. His had been strong and skilled and well-deserved. Hers was the sound of people who have been surprised at a level that changes something, who applaud not just performance, but revelation. It lasted for over a minute. She stood at the podium and received it with the quiet dignity of a woman who had waited a long time for the 2 numbers to match, and who was not, now that they finally did, going to pretend the moment was small. It was not small. David Hale came back to the podium for the Q&A, and the first question came from Susan Park, the private equity partner who had reduced her IPO commitment to Crawford Capital by 40% 3 weeks earlier. "Ms. Hartwell," Susan said, "given Hartwell Capital's performance record over the past 15 years, which I think I speak for many in this room in saying is frankly more impressive than most of us realized, What is your assessment of where private equity as a sector is undervaluing assets right now? It was not a simple question. It was a question that contained an invitation to speak with authority, to stake a position to claim the room. Claire answered it for 12 minutes. When she was done, Susan Park nodded slowly and sat down with the expression of someone who has just confirmed something they had already suspected. In the far right section, Ethan Crawford stood up quietly and walked toward the exit. He left before the Q&A ended. Nobody watched him go. Or if they did, they chose to keep their attention on the woman at the podium. Claire took 3 more questions, all of them substantive, all of them from the kind of industry leaders whose questions in a public forum represented genuine institutional interest. She answered each one directly, without hedging, without the careful circumlocution of someone protecting a fragile position. She was not fragile. She had not been fragile for a very long time. When the session ended and she stepped off the stage, the first person to reach her was Margaret Ewan, who had flown to Chicago specifically for this, and who said nothing except to grip her arm once with a hand that had in it everything that didn't need to be said. The second person was James, who was crying in the specific way of people who have committed to not crying and are failing. "Don't," Claire said, and she was smiling. "I'm not," he said, clearly crying. The third person was a woman she didn't recognize, mid-50s, dark suit, the self-contained bearing of someone who moved in significant professional circles. She extended her hand and said, "My name is Renata Cross. I run the Cross family office out of Boston. I've been looking for a private equity partnership for 2 years. I would very much like to have a conversation with you." Claire shook her hand. "Call my office Monday morning," she said. "Tell Diane I said to put you through directly." Renata Cross nodded once and stepped back, and 3 more people were already moving forward. The lobby outside the ballroom was controlled chaos conversations, erupting phones appearing the specific energy of a financial event where something unexpected has happened, and everyone is simultaneously processing it and calculating its implications. Claire moved through it with Diane at her shoulder, responding to the people who approached, accepting cards and committing to follow-up calls, with the calm efficiency of someone who has always known how to work a room, but has simply for a long time chosen not to. Diane leaned in as they moved. 11 meeting requests in the last 20 minutes. I'm logging them as they come in. Keep logging, Claire said. There are also 2 messages from journalists. Not tonight. And 1 from Patricia Sue. Claire paused for half a beat. Patricia Sue, her divorce lawyer. What does Patricia say? Diane read from her phone. Tell your client that I have never been happier to have been ignored, watching from home. She's magnificent. Claire let herself smile fully for the first time all day. Tell her thank you, she said. Tell her to bill me for the text. She kept moving. Behind her, the ballroom was still full of the conversation she had started. Ahead of her 11 meetings, 2 journalist requests, a Boston family office, and 3 months of work that had been building to this afternoon. She had not planned the collision with Ethan. She had not needed to. She had simply shown up fully and completely and let the truth do what it had always been capable of doing when given enough space. The truth had a way of presenting itself eventually. Edward Hartwell had told her that too. She had believed him then. She believed him more now. The flight back from Chicago landed at JFK at 11:20 that night, and by the time Claire was in a car heading back to her apartment, her phone had received more messages than it had accumulated in the entire previous month combined. She didn't read most of them that night. She got homemade tea, sat at her kitchen table for 20 minutes, in the specific silence of someone who has just done something significant and needs time to let it settle before the world rushes back in. Then she went to bed. She slept better than she had in years. Ethan Crawford did not sleep at all. He got back to his hotel room in Chicago at 9:15 that evening. He had left the summit early, taken a car alone, told Marcus he didn't need anything, which Marcus clearly didn't believe but respected anyway. He sat in that hotel room for 3 hours and did something he almost never did. He thought about himself honestly. Not the version of himself he presented to boardrooms and press junkets, and the social circles where his identity had been carefully and expensively constructed over 2 decades. Not the Ethan Crawford who had built a company and commanded rooms and believed with a sincerity that made it worse rather than better that he had done it all himself. The real version, the one underneath. He thought about Claire at 27, meeting him at a charity benefit, and laughing at something he said, genuinely laughing, and how that laugh had felt like being seen by someone who didn't need anything from him. He had loved her for that. He had loved her in the beginning with the specific intensity of a man who has spent his entire life in rooms where everyone wants something and has suddenly encountered someone who seems to want only him. And then he had spent 10 years turning her into furniture. He thought about that word furniture, and it sat in his chest like something with weight and edges. He thought about every dinner party where he had spoken over her, every introduction where he had described her by what she was to him rather than who she was in herself. Every morning he had left for the office without asking how she was, not because he didn't care, but because the question had simply stopped occurring to him, which was worse. He thought about the conference room, the papers hitting her face, the speech he had given to a room full of witnesses about how everything belonged to him, and she had been lucky to stand beside him. And then he thought about her standing at that podium today, the keynote speaker, the chairwoman, the woman who had sat across from him in that conference room and signed her name without a word, and walked out carrying one suitcase while possessing more wealth than he would accumulate in 3 lifetimes. She had let him believe she was nothing. She had let him say she was nothing. And she had done it, not from weakness, but from a kind of strength. He was only now beginning to understand the strength of someone who knows their own worth so completely that they don't need the room to confirm it. He had needed the room to confirm it every single day of his life. He understood sitting in that Chicago hotel room at midnight that this was perhaps the most significant difference between them. His phone buzzed, then again, then 3 more times in quick succession. He looked at it. The financial news cycle had caught the story with both hands and was running. 3 major outlets had published pieces within hours of the keynote. He read the headlines and each one landed like a separate impact. Hartwell Capital's Claire Crawford delivers Summit's most talked about keynote in a decade. Who is Claire Hartwell Crawford, the billionaire who built her empire while no one was watching? After Crawford, divorce questions mount about which Crawford was actually driving the bus. That last one he read twice. Then he put the phone face down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. His PR team had already sent a message. 7 people on that chain, all of them in various states of controlled urgency. All of them using the careful language of professionals who understood that what was happening was serious but needed to be communicated without triggering panic. The message distilled was, "We need a response strategy. Call us in the morning." He did not call them in the morning. He called them at 1 a.m. because he could not sleep, and because he understood that by morning the story would have metastasized in ways that a delayed response would make worse. His head of PR, a man named Scott Wen, who had managed corporate communications for 20 years, and who was the most unflappable professional Ethan had ever hired, answered on the second ring. "Talk to me," Ethan said. "It's moving fast," Scott said. "The Catherine Bell piece gave it legs. The summit gave it a stadium. We're looking at significant pickup across financial media, and it's starting to cross over into general business press." "What's the narrative?" Scott was quiet for exactly 1 second, which for Scott Wen was the equivalent of a long pause. "The narrative," he said carefully, "is that your ex-wife is more impressive than most people realized, and that raises questions about the decade of your marriage that we cannot fully answer publicly. Can we get ahead of it?" "We can manage it," Scott said. "But Ethan, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly." "Go." "Is there any involvement she had in Crawford Capital decisions, any access she had to information that influenced your strategy that could surface in a way we're not prepared for?" The hotel room was very quiet. "She gave me advice," Ethan said. "Over the years, informally. I didn't know the full extent of her background when I was acting on it." Another Scott Wen pause. Longer this time. How significant was the advice? Ethan thought about the Pacific Rim decision, the Kellerman restructuring, the Northbrook exit. He thought about the Hong Kong banker at the dinner party. He thought about the cash flow crisis in the first month of their marriage and the investment that had appeared through channels he had never fully examined at exactly the right moment. "Significant," he said. Scott exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who had been hoping for a different answer. "Okay," he said. "Then here's what we do not do. We do not issue a statement that in any way engages with the question of her contribution. We do not comment on her keynote. We do not acknowledge the narrative in any form that gives it more oxygen. And what do? We focus entirely on the IPO, on the company's current performance and future vision. We give the press corps nothing to connect to the personal story." "Will that work?" This time the pause was the longest. "It will slow the story," Scott said. "I can't promise you it stops it, Ethan said nothing. There's also the board, Scott said. I'd expect to hear from them in the morning. He heard from them before morning. At 7:15 Chicago time, while he was still in the hotel, his phone rang with a call from the board's lead independent director, a man named Franklin Hart, who was 71 years old, had served on 11 major corporate boards in his career, and communicated exclusively in complete, precise sentences that contained exactly as much as they needed to, and nothing more. Ethan, Franklin said, the board is convening an emergency call at 9 this morning, Eastern Time. I'll be on it. Good. A pause. I want to be direct with you before we get to the group. There are concerns among several members about the reputational trajectory and its potential impact on the IPO pricing. I understand the concern, Ethan said. I believe it's manageable. That may be, Franklin said. But I want you to understand that the conversation this morning is not only about the IPO. Ethan stood very still. What else is it about? Franklin Hart was quiet for 3 seconds. Leadership continuity, he said. Come prepared to discuss it. He hung up. Ethan put the phone down and sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in his professional life, felt something he had no experience managing: genuine uncertainty about whether he was going to survive the next 24 hours professionally intact. He had built Crawford Capital. He had led it for 15 years. He had grown it from a mid-size asset management firm into one of the most recognized names in private equity. That was real. Whatever else was true, whatever contribution Claire had made, whatever questions were being asked about the architecture of his success, the company existed because of his work. But he was beginning to understand that the story of how success is built and the story of who gets credit for it are two different stories, and when they diverge, the divergence has consequences. He got on the board call at 9. There were 11 board members. 3 of them said nothing for the entire 60-minute call. 4 of them asked careful, measured questions that were technically about the IPO and actually about something else. 2 of them, both of whom had been on the board for less than 3 years, defended Ethan in terms that were loyal but thin. Franklin Hart said almost nothing. And Douglas Crane, the same. Douglas Crane, who had chuckled in the conference room, who had told Claire she seemed perfectly suited for the life Ethan provides. Douglas Crane said in a tone that had traveled a significant distance from the casual confidence of that conference room. I think we need to consider what's in the best interest of the company going forward, setting aside personal considerations. No one is setting aside personal considerations, one of the younger board members said sharply. We're talking about a man who built this company. We're talking about a company that needs to go public in 6 weeks, Douglas said, and about whether the current situation affects our ability to do that at the valuation we've projected. The call did not reach a conclusion. It reached a pause, the kind of pause that experienced board members use when they are not yet ready to make a decision, but are making clear that a decision is coming. Franklin Hart closed the call by saying, "We'll reconvene Thursday. Ethan, please prepare a full presentation on IPO status and near-term strategy." I'll be ready, Ethan said. He said it with confidence. He had no idea if he was ready. Back in New York that afternoon, the Crawford Capital offices had a specific energy, the energy of a workplace whose public-facing narrative has developed a significant crack, and everyone inside can feel the draft coming through. People were professional. They were focused. No one said anything directly. But Ethan felt it the moment he walked off the elevator. The fractional delays before people met his eyes. The conversations that didn't quite stop when he appeared, but that changed register in a way that was impossible to miss if you had spent 15 years reading rooms. Marcus was at his desk with a stack of messages and the expression he wore when the situation exceeded normal operational parameters. "Talk to me," Ethan said, same words he'd used with Scott at 1 in the morning. "Susan Park's office called," Marcus said. "They've formally reduced their IPO commitment. The new number is in the file." He handed over a folder. "2 other institutional investors have requested the additional due diligence documentation that Scott's team is preparing." Ethan opened the folder, looked at Susan Park's new number, then looked at the previous number. The difference was not 40% anymore, it was 55. "What else?" Ethan said. 3 more former employees have posted on social media. Scott's team is monitoring. None of them are under active NDA. "What are they saying?" Marcus hesitated for the first time. "Variations on the same theme," he said, "that strategic decisions they observed during their tenure had characteristics that suggested external expertise beyond the internal team." Ethan put the folder down. And Alexandra called, Marcus said. 3 times. I'll call her back. He did not call her back that day. He sat in his office and worked the phones, investors, partners, 2 members of his senior team, trying to put his hands on a situation that kept moving faster than his hands could reach. At 4 in the afternoon, his general counsel knocked and came in without waiting, which told Ethan everything about the urgency before the man opened his mouth. "We have a problem," said Richard Hale, who had been Crawford Capital's GC for 8 years and who did not use the word problem lightly. "One of the former employees, the analyst who posted first, has been contacted by a journalist, not financial press, a general business reporter at a national outlet." "What journalist?" "Someone from the Post, business desk. They've sent a formal inquiry to our communications team requesting comment on the role of external strategic consultation in Crawford Capital's decision-making over the past decade." Ethan looked at him. "That's a fishing expedition." "Possibly," Richard said, "but the specific decisions they've named in the inquiry are not random. Someone has done research. The Pacific Rim entry, the Kellerman deal, the timing of the Northbrook exit." He paused. "Ethan, these are the decisions that correlate most directly with what we know about Claire's expertise." The office was very quiet. "Someone talked to them," Ethan said. "Multiple someones from the look of it." "Can we find out who?" "We can try, but that's not the most pressing question right now." Richard sat down across from him, which he rarely did unbidden. "The most pressing question is what we say when they run the story, because they will run it. The inquiry is a courtesy call." Ethan sat back. He thought about what Scott had told him at 1 in the morning. Don't engage, don't give it oxygen, stay focused on the IPO. And he thought about something else, something that had been sitting in the back of his mind since that hotel room in Chicago at midnight, since he had stared at the ceiling and done the thing he almost never did. He thought about what was actually true. "Richard," he said carefully, "if we issue a statement denying any significant external involvement in strategic decisions and evidence surfaces later that contradicts that statement, what is our exposure?" Richard looked at him for a long moment. "Significant," he said, "particularly in an IPO context. Material misrepresentation of company operations is not a small problem. And if we say nothing, the story runs without our voice in it." Ethan nodded slowly. He was doing the calculation, not the financial calculation, though that was also running, but the deeper one, the calculation about what was survivable and what wasn't, about the difference between a story that peaks and fades and a story that keeps finding new evidence because the evidence is real. "Give me tonight," he said. "I'll have a decision by tomorrow morning." Richard left. At 6 o'clock, Alexandra appeared in his office doorway. She had come to the building, which she had never done before, without calling first, and the fact that she was here without calling told him something about where she was. She stood in the doorway and looked at him and said, "Are you going to tell me what's happening? Because I've been watching the news for 2 days, and you haven't returned my calls, and I think I deserve a conversation." She was right. She deserved a conversation. He said, "Close the door." She came in and sat across from him, and he looked at her, really looked at her the way he had failed to look at people for years, and he said, "The company is in a difficult moment. The press is asking questions I can't fully answer. The board is asking questions about my leadership. And I spent last night in a hotel room in Chicago, realizing that most of it is consequences I earned." Alexandra stared at him. She had clearly been prepared for defensiveness for corporate speak for the version of Ethan, who managed difficult conversations by controlling them. This version was different, and she didn't quite know what to do with it. "Consequences from the divorce," she said carefully. "Consequences from the marriage," he said. "From who I was in it. From what I failed to understand for 10 years about the person I was married to." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you still in love with her?" It was the question he had expected, and the one he was least equipped to answer simply. "No," he said. "I don't think I ever loved her the way she deserved to be loved. That's the honest answer, and I think part of me has known that for a long time and didn't want to look at it." Alexandra looked at him for a long time. "I don't think I can do this," she said, not dramatically, quietly in the way of someone who has thought it through and reached a conclusion. "Not this version of it, not whatever this is." "I know," he said. She picked up her bag, stood, looked at him one more time. "I hope things get better for you, Ethan. I mean that genuinely." She left. He sat alone in his office for a long time after that. The board meeting on Thursday was the most difficult 2 hours of Ethan Crawford's professional life. He came prepared. He presented the IPO strategy with full data current investor commitments, revised pricing range timeline market positioning. He presented it well because presenting things well was something he genuinely knew how to do. But Franklin Hart let him finish and then said with the precise economy of a man who has reached a decision and is now communicating it. The board has discussed this at length over the past 48 hours. I want to give you our collective position directly. Ethan said, go ahead. There are two separate issues, Franklin said. The first is the IPO. We believe the IPO should proceed, but at a revised valuation reflecting current market conditions and investor sentiment. Scott's team is already adjusting the model. And the second issue, Ethan said. The board is requesting that you step back from the CEO role during the IPO process, Franklin said. Not permanently. We are proposing a transition to executive chairman with an interim CEO to be identified within 30 days who will lead the public offering. The silence in the room lasted 5 seconds. Ethan counted them the way he had counted them in Susan Park's office, because counting seconds was what his brain did when it was processing something it hadn't prepared for. You're asking me to step down, he said. We're asking you to step back, Franklin said. There is a difference. Not from where I'm sitting. Ethan, Franklin's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who has made difficult calls for 50 years and understands that kindness and clarity are not opposites. You built this company. No one in this room is disputing that. What we are saying is that the current story, the public narrative that has developed over the past 6 weeks, has created conditions in which your personal profile is affecting the company's ability to execute. That is not a statement about your value. It is a statement about timing. The story was created by a divorce and a keynote address, Ethan said, neither of which I controlled. No, Franklin agreed, but both of which are consequences of decisions you made, and the board's responsibility is to the company, not to the consequences of decisions you made. It was the most direct thing Franklin Hart had ever said to him. Ethan looked around the table. Douglas Crane was looking at the table. The younger board members who had defended him on Monday were now looking somewhere between him and Franklin, with expressions that told him the conversation before this meeting had gone, a direction that made their earlier defense feel premature. He understood. He had spent 15 years in enough boardrooms to understand when a decision has already been made, and the meeting is the communication of it rather than the making of it. I want it on record, Ethan said, that I disagree with this decision. Noted, Franklin said, and I want full participation in the selection of the interim CEO. That is reasonable and we agree to it. He nodded once. Then he gathered his materials and stood. I'll have my transition plan to you by end of week. He walked out of the boardroom with his back straight and his face controlled, and he did not say anything to anyone until he was in the elevator alone and the doors had closed. Then he leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. 15 years. He had spent 15 years building that company, and one keynote address in Chicago had taken the CEO chair from him. That was the simple version of it. The simple version was also the false version, because the keynote hadn't taken anything from him. It had simply illuminated what had already been there, the questions and the cracks and the consequences that had been accumulating for years, like water behind a dam. I thought about what Franklin had said. Consequences of decisions you made. He had made a decision to dismiss Claire in that conference room. He had made a decision to spend 10 years not seeing her. He had made a decision, 10,000 small daily decisions compounded over a decade, to be the kind of man who throws papers at his wife's face in front of witnesses and calls it maturity. Those decisions had consequences. He was living in them now. When the elevator reached the lobby, he walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The city moved around him, cabs, pedestrians, a delivery bike threading between cars, with the total indifference of New York to any individual human drama, no matter how large it felt from the inside. He thought about calling Claire. He pulled out his phone, found her number, looked at it, and then he put the phone back in his pocket. He did not have the right to call her. Not today, not yet, possibly not ever. Whatever he needed to say to her, whatever accounting he owed her, it could not be offered as a phone call made from the sidewalk of a building where he had just been removed from his own CEO chair. That would make his call about him. And for once in his life he understood it needed to not be about him. He started walking. He walked for over an hour. Through Midtown, down toward the river, through streets he had driven, but rarely walked. He walked with his hands in his pockets and his face into the wind, and he thought about who he had been and who that had cost. It cost Claire 10 years of making herself small. It cost his board their full confidence. It cost his investors their certainty. It cost Alexandra whatever future they might have had. And it had cost him the chair he'd spent 15 years earning. Not because Claire had taken it. She had taken nothing. She had simply finally stood up fully in a room and let the truth exist at full height. The cost was his own, all of it. He stopped walking when he reached the river. He stood there for a while with the water moving and the city behind him, and a sky that had gone from gray to the particular deep blue of early evening. He took out his phone. He didn't call Claire. He opened a blank note and started writing. Not to her, not yet, just for himself. The beginning of an accounting he understood he owed not to her, not to the board, not to the press or the investors or anyone else, but to the version of himself that had somehow, somewhere in the middle of success, lost the ability to see other people clearly. He wrote for a long time. By the time he stopped, it was fully dark and he was cold, and his phone had 17 unread messages that he did not look at. He looked at what he had written instead. It was not a press release. It was not a strategy. It was not the kind of thing Ethan Crawford had ever produced before in his life. It was honest. And it was the first thing he had written in years that did not require anyone to believe something that wasn't true. He put the phone in his pocket and walked back toward Midtown. He had a company to help transition. He had a board to work with. He had somewhere ahead of him the long and unglamorous process of rebuilding not the company which would survive, but himself. That was the work now. He didn't know yet if he was capable of it. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was asking the question honestly. And that he understood walking through the November dark of a city that owed him nothing was where every real thing began. The Monday after the Chicago summit, Claire walked into Hartwell Capital at 7:45 in the morning and found 43 emails waiting from institutional investors, family offices, and private equity partners she had never directly spoken to before. Diane had organized them by priority before Claire arrived. The top 12 were flagged red, meaning Diane's judgment was that these were not routine inquiries, but genuine expressions of serious capital interest. Claire read through all 12 before her first cup of coffee was finished. Then she called James. He picked up on the first ring. He had clearly been awake for some time. "I know," he said before she could speak. "I've been in since 6. Robert and I have been going through the inbound." "What's your read?" "Conservative estimate. We're looking at somewhere between 4 and 6 serious partnership conversations that could move in the next 90 days. The Cross family office alone is representing capital that would accelerate our European expansion by 18 months. Claire set down her coffee. "Get me a meeting with Renata Cross this week." "Already scheduled, Thursday at 2. She paused. "James?" "Yes. Good work." A brief silence, the silence of a man who had been waiting years to be on the receiving end of that particular 2-word sentence from this particular person. "Thank you," he said. And then, because James Whitfield was not a sentimental man by nature, and was therefore doubly convincing when sentiment broke through, "We should have been doing this 6 years ago." "We're doing it now," Claire said. "That's what matters." She hung up and got to work. What the next 3 weeks looked like from the inside was controlled intensity. Meeting after meeting, call after call, the specific productive chaos of a company that has been operating at 70% capacity and has suddenly been given permission to run at full speed. Claire moved through it with the focused energy of someone who has been waiting for exactly this, not impatiently, not with the restlessness of someone frustrated by delay, but with the stored precision of a woman who used the waiting years well and is now deploying everything she accumulated. Renata Cross arrived Thursday at 1:58, 2 minutes early, which told Claire something useful about her. She was 54, ran the Cross family office with a reputation for being extraordinarily selective about partnerships, and she had the self-contained quality of someone who had operated at significant levels long enough that she no longer needed to perform competence, it simply radiated. She sat across from Claire and said within the first 5 minutes, "I want to skip the preliminaries. I've done the research. Hartwell Capital's 15-year record speaks for itself, and frankly should have been making more noise than it has. What I want to understand is your vision for the next 10 years, not the presentation version, the real version." Claire looked at her for a moment. Then she leaned forward and talked for 40 minutes without notes. She talked about mid-market companies with exceptional fundamentals and poor access to growth capital, the ones that fell below the radar of large private equity because they weren't glamorous enough, and above the threshold of small firms because they required more sophisticated management. She talked about the geographic expansion into European markets where American private equity had been consistently underweighted. She talked about a new fund structure she had been developing for 8 months that would allow institutional partners to participate at lower minimums with higher transparency than traditional private equity vehicles. She talked about where value was hiding before anyone else could see it. Renata Cross did not take notes. She just listened with the complete attention of someone who has heard a great many pitches and knows within the first 10 minutes which category this one belongs in. When Claire finished, Renata said, "Your grandfather taught you to talk about investment the way other people talk about something they love." Claire was quiet for a moment. "He taught me to see it that way. Yes. The fund structure you're describing, the lower minimum, higher transparency vehicle. What's the timeline for launch?" 6 months if we move decisively, 8 if we don't. Renata nodded once. "I want to be in it. Anchor position. Let's talk numbers." They talked numbers for another hour. When Renata Cross left, she shook Claire's hand and said, "I've been doing this for 28 years. I've sat across from a lot of brilliant people. What you have isn't just intelligence, it's judgment. That's rarer." Claire said, "Thank you. I look forward to building something significant together." After Renata left, Claire sat alone in her office for exactly 4 minutes. She let herself feel the size of what was happening, really feel it, not the contained professional acknowledgement she maintained in front of her team, but the real thing, the knowledge that something she had tended quietly and privately for 15 years was now growing in full sunlight at a pace that was extraordinary. Then Diane knocked and said the next call was in 3 minutes, and Claire picked up her phone and went back to work. Meanwhile, 30 blocks south, Ethan Crawford's transition was proceeding with the kind of corporate efficiency that strips personal drama from professional consequence and makes everything look from the outside like a planned and orderly evolution. The press release announcing his move to executive chairman and the appointment of an interim CEO, a respected industry veteran named Carol Simmons, who had run 2 successful IPOs in the past decade, was carefully worded and professionally delivered. Scott Wynn's team managed the rollout with precision. Most of the financial press covered it as a strategic transition rather than a forced removal, which was both the best possible outcome and a significant distance from what it actually was. Ethan showed up to the transition briefings. He contributed to the IPO preparation. He did the things required of him with the professional discipline of a man who understood that how he handled this chapter would define what came after it. But the internal experience of those weeks was something different from the external presentation. He called his mother for the first time in 4 months. She was 73, lived in Connecticut, and had always had a way of saying difficult things in a tone so level it bypassed defensiveness and landed directly in the part of you that knew she was right. "I heard," she said when he called. She didn't specify what she had heard. She didn't need to. "I know. How are you actually doing? Not the answer you give people, the real one." I was in his car parked outside his building because he had found in the past few weeks that some conversations required stillness, and the only place he could find reliable stillness was alone in a car. "I've been better," he said. "I've also been worse. I'm somewhere in the middle trying to figure out what the next version of this looks like." "The next version of what?" "Me," he said. "The company is going to be fine. Carol Simmons is excellent. The IPO will go. The structure is solid." He paused. "But I've been sitting with some things about who I've been, and I can't just manage my way out of it the way I manage everything else." His mother was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was the same level tone it always was, but underneath it something had shifted into something softer. "You were always the most capable person in every room you entered, Ethan, from the time you were a little boy, and I love that about you. But I watched you learn over the years that being the most capable person meant you didn't have to look too carefully at anyone else. And I should have said something about that sooner. Mom, I'm not saying it to make you feel worse. I'm saying it because you called me for the real conversation, and that's the real conversation." He sat with that for a moment. "I know." Claire was a good woman, his mother said. She was a good woman, and I think she loved you genuinely, and I think what you did to her in that conference room— Yes, I know about the conference room. Ellen Hartwell and I have been friends for 30 years, and Ellen told me within 48 hours, I think what you did in that room is something you're going to need to reckon with properly. Not manage. Reckon with. He closed his eyes. I know. Good, she said. And then, because she was his mother, and this was how she had always operated, difficult truth followed immediately by unconditional love, the two things together rather than one without the other. Come for dinner Sunday. I'll make the pot roast you've always liked, and we can talk about what comes next. Yeah, he said. Okay, she said. Sunday. He drove home. 6 weeks after Chicago, Claire got a phone call from a woman named Dr. Marguerite Ashe, who ran a nonprofit organization called the Financial Equity Project, a foundation dedicated to providing financial education and legal resources to women experiencing economic abuse in divorce proceedings. Dr. Ashe had seen the Catherine Bell article and had then seen the summit coverage and had tracked down Claire's office number through what she described as a slightly embarrassing amount of effort. I'll be direct, Dr. Ashe said when Diane put her through. What happened to you in that conference room, the settlement, the public humiliation, the decade of invisible contribution that was legally attributed to someone else, happens to women every day. Women who don't have $38 billion. Women who walk out of those rooms with nothing and no recourse and no platform. Claire said nothing, listening. You have a platform now, Dr. Ashe said. A significant one. And I'm calling to ask if you would consider using it. Claire asked her 3 questions. What does the organization do specifically? What does it need to do more of? What would meaningful support actually look like, not in a press release sense, but in a real operational sense? Dr. Ashe answered all 3 questions with the directness of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had no patience for the performance of philanthropy. When she finished, Claire said, Send me the full organizational report, financials, program outcomes, current gaps. I want to read everything before I commit to anything. Of course, Dr. Ashe said. And then with a slight shift in her professional tone, the shift of someone deciding to say the personal thing rather than the professional thing. Can I say one more thing that isn't a pitch? Go ahead. The image of you picking those papers up off the floor has been shared in online communities for women going through difficult divorces more times than I can count. You don't know this because it's not your world. But there are thousands of women who watched that story and felt seen in a way they rarely feel seen. She paused. Whatever you decide about the foundation, I wanted you to know that. Claire sat with that for a long moment. Send me the report, she said. I'll read it this weekend. She read it Saturday morning, cover to cover, 340 pages of program data and financial statements and case studies. She made notes in the margins, not the performative notes of someone demonstrating engagement, but the dense, specific notes of someone doing real analysis, the kind her grandfather had always made. By Sunday morning, she had 3 pages of questions and a preliminary commitment figure in mind that made Ellen, when Claire told her over the phone, inhale sharply. That's not a donation, Ellen said. That's a restructuring. It needs to be restructured, Claire said. The model is good. The execution is underfunded. Marguerite Ashe knows exactly what she's doing, and she's been doing it on a budget that should embarrass people with the capacity to do more. You sound like Grandpa, Ellen said, when he found something he believed in. Claire smiled. Good. That's exactly how it should sound. She called Dr. Ashe Monday morning. She committed to a 3-year funding partnership. Not a grant, a structured partnership with operational support board participation and a specific expansion plan targeting 3 additional cities in year 1. She also committed to a mentorship program she wanted to build inside the foundation structure, pairing women rebuilding their financial lives after exploitative divorces with financial professionals who could provide direct practical guidance. Dr. Ashe was silent for 4 seconds after Claire laid out the terms. Then she said, Do you know how long I've been trying to build what you just described in 30 seconds? Tell me. 7 years. Then let's not waste any more time, Claire said. The foundation work became, alongside the Hartwell Capital expansion, the second current of energy running through Claire's days, and she found in ways she hadn't expected that the 2 projects fed each other rather than competing. The clarity she brought to corporate acquisitions was the same clarity she brought to organizational strategy. The instinct for where value was hiding for what was underestimated and undersupported applied equally to a mid-market logistics company in Nashville and to a foundation that was doing extraordinary work without sufficient resources. Her grandfather had told her once that the best investors were the ones who could see beyond the financial statement to the human infrastructure, underneath the quality of the people, the soundness of the belief system driving their decisions, the integrity of the thing at its core. He had been talking about companies. She understood now that he had been describing something much larger. 2 months after Chicago, on a Tuesday evening in January, Diane knocked on Claire's office door at 7:15 late. Claire had been reviewing a portfolio analysis and said, "There's something you should know about." She set a printout on the desk. It was a short piece from a financial blog, not major press, but well-read in industry circles. The headline said, "Ethan Crawford steps back from Crawford Capital IPO, day-to-day sources say transition is permanent." Claire read it. Then she set it down. "Did you want me to?" Diane started. "No," Claire said. "Thank you, Diane. That's all." Diane nodded and left. Claire sat alone with the article for a moment. She thought about what she felt, and what she felt was less than she had expected. Not satisfaction. She had never wanted his destruction, had never organized any part of what she was building around his diminishment. Not grief exactly. Something more like the specific sadness of watching a consequence arrive that was always coming, and that you could have seen coming years before it did. He had removed himself from her life with that conference room. He had removed himself from the story she was building the moment she walked out of that building with her suitcase. Whatever was happening to him now was not her chapter. She turned back to the portfolio analysis. She worked until 9. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Not an email. A letter handwritten on plain white paper delivered to the Hartwell Capital offices in an envelope addressed in handwriting she recognized immediately because she had seen it on birthday cards and notes left on kitchen counters and the back of grocery lists for 10 years. Diane brought it in without comment, set it on the desk, and left. Claire looked at it for a long time before she opened it. Inside was a single page, handwritten. The handwriting was careful in the way of someone who has written and rewritten the same thing many times and is giving you the final version. It read, "Claire, I've started this letter 14 times. I'm sending this version not because it's the right words. I don't think I have the right words, but because I've understood recently that waiting for the right words is another way of protecting myself. And protecting myself is something I've done at your expense for long enough. I'm not writing to ask for anything. Not forgiveness, not conversation, not a response of any kind. I'm writing because I owe you an accounting, and this is the only form of it I can offer that isn't also underneath about what I need. You built something extraordinary. You built it while standing next to me and letting me believe I was the one building. I don't know what that cost you. I don't think I'm capable of fully knowing. But I know it cost more than anyone should have asked of you. I spent 10 years looking at you and somehow never saw you. That is the truest thing I know how to say. I hope what you're building now is everything it should be. I hope you are everything you always were without the weight of having to pretend otherwise. I'm sorry, Claire, for all of it." It was signed with just his first name. Claire read it once, then she read it again. She sat with it for a long time, not with the emotion she might have expected a year ago. Not the complicated grief of a woman still tangled in what had been, but with something quieter and more complete. The letter was honest. She could feel in the specificity of it that it was honest, not the managed honesty of someone doing PR on their own character, but the real thing, the unglamorous, self-aware thing. She folded it carefully. She put it in the left-hand drawer of her desk. Then she sat for a moment longer, and she thought about her grandfather, and she thought about the Sunday dinners, and she thought about a question he had never explicitly answered, but that she understood now more completely than she ever had. What do you do when you finally know what something is actually worth? You build accordingly. She opened her laptop. She had a European acquisition proposal to review. She had a foundation expansion plan to finalize. She had a new fund structure launching in 4 months, and a board meeting in 3 days, and a mentorship cohort of 37 women who were at various stages of rebuilding their financial lives with the support of the organization she was helping to transform. She had, in other words, a great deal of work to do, and she did it. The Foundation's first annual dinner was held in April, 8 months after the divorce. 500 attendees. Major donors program participants, past and present financial industry professionals who had joined the mentorship program, and a small group of women currently enrolled in the Foundation's legal and financial education programs, women who had been invited not as recipients of charity, but as the people the entire evening was fundamentally about. Claire gave the keynote. It was nothing like the Chicago keynote. It was shorter, less polished, less strategic. It was the kind of speech that happens when someone stands at a podium and tells the truth without worrying about what the truth costs them in the room. She talked about the conference room. She talked about picking the papers up off the floor. She talked about the suitcase. She talked about her grandfather and Sunday dinners, and the questions she had spent a lifetime learning to answer. She talked about the 10 years of making herself smaller, and the cost of that, and the specific work of unmaking that kind of smallness, which is different from and harder than the work of building something, because you have to dismantle something inside yourself that has been there long enough to feel like structure. At one point near the end, she looked out at the room and found the table where the program participants were sitting, the 30 women currently enrolled, the ones who had come tonight as guests of honor, rather than as donors or professionals, and she said directly to them the thing she most wanted them to hear. The most expensive lie I was ever told, she said, was that my value needed to be confirmed by someone else before it was real. I spent 10 years paying interest on that lie. I want you to hear me clearly tonight. Your value exists whether or not anyone in your life has been capable of seeing it. The failure of their vision is not a statement about what you are. It is only a statement about the limits of what they could see. The room was very quiet. Then a woman at the program participants' table, a woman in her early 50s who had come tonight from a transitional housing program 2 miles away, who was 3 months out of a 22-year marriage that had left her with nothing, who had enrolled in the Foundation's financial education program 6 weeks ago. This woman began to applaud, not politely, not in the reflexive way of a formal dinner where applause is a social obligation. She applauded with her whole body, with everything she had, standing up from her chair. And within seconds, the people around her were standing too, and within 30 seconds, the entire room was on its feet. 500 people. Claire stood at the podium and let it happen, and she did not perform composure. She let the moment be what it was. She let her eyes fill briefly, because some moments are too real for professional stillness, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of dishonesty. Ellen was at a table near the front. When Claire found her eyes in the room, Ellen was crying without apology and giving her the look she had given her across rooms their entire lives, the look that said, I always knew exactly who you were. Claire took a breath. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about what he had built and what she had been trusted to inherit, and what she had almost lost by trying to fit it inside the dimensions of someone else's belief about her. She thought about the suitcase, one small suitcase, and everything she carried that none of them could see. She thought about the papers on the floor, and her hands picking them up, and the elevator, and the rain on her face, and the cab, and the phone call. Schedule a board meeting for Thursday. Tell them the chairwoman is returning. She had returned. Not to the person she was before the marriage, because you cannot go back. Time doesn't work that way, and neither does growth. She had returned to something forward-facing, something that contained everything the years had given her, including the hard years, including the cost, and had made it into something that had more use in the world than it would have had if the cost had never been paid. The applause settled. She looked at the room one more time. Thank you, she said. Now let's get back to work. There was laughter. Warm, real, the laughter of a room full of people who have just been given permission to feel something and are now releasing it through the only sound that contains both joy and relief simultaneously. The evening continued. Months passed. Hartwell Capital's new fund launched in June. It was oversubscribed within 3 weeks of opening to investors, the first time in the company's history that demand had exceeded capacity at that pace. James Whitfield sent Claire a text at 11 in the evening on the day they closed the books. Your grandfather would have been insufferably proud. I say this as a compliment. She wrote back, get some sleep. He wrote back, already asleep, texting in my dreams. She laughed alone in her apartment at 11:15 on a Tuesday, and it was the kind of laughter that comes from genuine happiness, uncomplicated private belonging entirely to herself. The European expansion closed its first acquisition in September. a manufacturing holding company in Stuttgart that had been chronically undervalued for the precise reasons she had predicted, wrong sector categorization in the analyst reports, a management team that communicated poorly with investors despite executing brilliantly internally, and a balance sheet that required someone willing to read it carefully rather than relying on the surface numbers. She had read it carefully. She had known what it was worth. Crawford Capital's IPO proceeded in August, under Carol Simmons's leadership, at a lower valuation than originally projected, but successfully completed. Ethan remained executive chairman in name, but receded from public view in the way of someone engaged in a quieter project. Occasionally his name appeared in industry publications in connection with a board decision or a company statement. He gave no interviews. He did not seek the press coverage that had once been central to how he understood his own identity. People who knew him from before said he seemed different. Nobody could specify exactly how. In November, a year to the month after the divorce, Claire sat at her desk on a Friday evening after everyone else had gone home, and she did something she rarely did in the office. She sat without working. Just sat. With the city moving outside and the particular quiet of a building after hours, when the constant productive hum of people doing things fades, and what's left is the structure itself, the walls and the floors, and the history held in the space. She thought about the year. She thought about what it had cost and what it had built, and whether if she could go back to that conference room, she would change anything. The answer surprised her a little. She would not change the decade of making herself small, because the decade had taught her what smallness cost, and that knowledge was now the foundation of everything she was doing for other women who were learning the same lesson with fewer resources. She would not change the divorce, because the divorce had returned her to herself. She would not change the suitcase or the rain or the phone call or any of it, because all of it, the entire cost of it, had led to this office and this foundation and this life that was completely and finally and irrevocably her own. She would change one thing. She would have picked the papers up off that floor, signed them, walked out exactly as she had done, and she would have turned at the door of that conference room and said clearly to the room something she had swallowed because she had believed at the time that swallowing it was grace. She would have said, "I know exactly who I am. I always have." She hadn't said it then. She had spent a year saying it in ways that mattered more. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. She turned off the light in her office. She took the elevator down alone and walked through the lobby and stepped out into the November evening. The city was cold and bright and indifferent and alive the way it always was, the way it always would be, moving forward without ceremony or pause. She walked into it without hesitation, because Claire Hartwell Crawford had always known what she was worth. She had simply finally stopped being the only one who did.